Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom, the Right Honourable George Brown.
First, Mr. President, may I apologize for of this organization. I speak to you as a socialist and hence as an internationalist. I've breathed and lived and worked for social democracy from my early youth, and I've been inspired by the international ideals of my faith. The principles of freedom, of equality, and the importance of the individual, which lie at the base of our philosophy of democratic socialism, are not circumscribed by national boundaries. They are not limited in their application to certain places or countries or races. They apply universally throughout the world. Thus, I deem it as a great honor, as a culmination of all that I've worked for, to be able to address you today, to be able to play some part on this world stage in bringing about the ideals which have meant so much to me for so long. I do this without illusions, I hope, and without overestimation of what the United Nations can achieve. But I would like to proclaim the faith of my country and of myself in the United Nations, all that it stands for, and our determination to work in the most practical way for the fulfillment of its aims and its ideals. I have read, as you too will have done, the Secretary General's annual report. He is acting as the keeper of our conscience, recalling us to our duty and pointing out the tasks ahead. The report he makes is a disturbing one, but I believe he was right to make it. No one can honestly challenge the correctness of his diagnosis. For my part, I approach the United Nations in a mood of constructive discontent. The Secretary General and I fairly clearly have been thinking along the same lines. We today face problems of appalling gravity, but it would be strange if it were otherwise. For the United Nations is seldom called upon to intervene before a situation has proved to be beyond the resources of conventional diplomacy and beyond the wit of national statesmen. Had an effective United Nations existed in the past, it might have avoided many senseless conflicts and the insane massacres of 2 world wars. War has never been and never will be a solution. There are no victors in war. But no one of us seems ready yet to accept the logical consequences of this. For what do we see around us? The deep tragedy of the war in Vietnam, less publicized battles in Africa and in Asia, tyrannies based on race, ideology, or sheer lust for power, which deny the most basic human freedoms and the whole concept of the United Nations Charter. The pitifully slow progress towards peacemaking and peacekeeping. The failure of the nations of the world to disarm. The contamination of underground tests.
And whole areas of the Pacific Ocean blanketed off for experiments with rockets.
And perhaps in its way, most terrifying of all,
the grinding misery.
This situation calls for imagination and for a readiness to take risks. Otherwise, we shall indeed soon be at the edge of the precipice. We all know that our long-term aim is that of general and complete disarmament under international control. We all want this to come about, but nobody in his senses thinks it's just around the corner. What we have to do, I suggest, at once, are 3 things. First, to recognize that the most immediate risk is presented by the possible spread of nuclear weapons to countries which do not now possess them. And recognizing that, to agree on the text of a non-proliferation treaty to bring this process to a halt. Second, to extend the partial test ban treaty to include underground explosions as well, in order to prevent the existing nuclear powers both from developing these frightful weapons and also from devising even more dangerous systems. And third, to bring the Chinese People's Republic into the international community of nations and especially into regular and effective negotiations on disarmament. Of course, there are serious difficulties in the way of achieving even these limited objectives. But I am confident that if we look at the terrible dangers which confront us, we shall reach the conclusion that we have to solve the problems, and that they can be solved if we are ready to take some calculated risks and give up a little of the mistrust and suspicion which has characterized international relations for so long. Mr. President, so much of what we have to discuss is a formidable and an awe-inspiring story. We none of us expect that the United Nations will be able to find solutions to all these problems in the next year or even in the next 5 years. All any of us can ask is that the organization and each of us who are members of it should go at our tasks with courage, with practical sense, and with idealism, but entirely without illusions. We must see that what the organization can bear and not place intolerable burdens upon it. We must not think that a resolution which has no connection with reality is a substitute for action. The United Nations has, of course, its role as a sounding board for world opinion, and it is in the true spirit of democracy that all should declare their beliefs here, frankly and fearlessly. Let us say what we think, honestly and straightforwardly, and let us proceed to solve the problems that face the world in a practical and in a humane way. Let us really try to make the United Nations a center for harmonizing the interests of its members. Let us discuss our differences, but let us try to see the other man's point of view. Let us work in the lobbies and in the committee rooms to reach solutions. Let us never take up rigid public positions from which there is then no retreat. Our job is the peace of the world and the happiness of the human race. More than that, it is to save people not only from the chance of battle, but from the certainty of poverty and hunger. Our business is to bring all that to an end. That their national interest, indeed their greatest national interest, is in fact the strengthening of this organization. Many are still prepared to act in pursuit of what they consider to be their immediate aims. They don't even seem to mind if this leads to a weakening of this organization. But the United Nations is vital to all of us. Without it, we shall all go under. Thus, its strengthening must be the supreme national interest, and the realization of this in a small way would be the beginning of wisdom for all member states and could bring about a wondrous change in the prospects for world peace. This change could be immediately effective in and will be signing it today. In his report, the Secretary General goes on to speak of colonialism and points a finger at the colonial powers. I share his view. I share his impatience. All my political life, I have fought against colonialism, and I am proud of the part that we have played in the peaceful transition from dependence to independence and from empire to commonwealth. I hope that no one will try to reverse this process, and that there will be no neo-colonialism or interference with hard-won independence. For their part, the British government are guided and shall continue to be guided by the principle that the interests of the inhabitants of the territories for which they still have responsibility are paramount. Britain stands ready to give independence to territories that want it and can sustain it. But certain problems of decolonization remain. It is inevitable that these are some of the most difficult. They cannot be settled by a mixture of theory and enthusiasm. They are practical problems which need practical solutions. We are happy to have your help, provided it is offered impartially in the true interests of the people concerned. Judge the problems impartially and objectively. It may be thought in some sectors that because our approach is liberal and humanitarian, that we can be forced into hasty and partisan solutions. This is not so. Our objective is clear, and we intend to reach it in an orderly and a fair-minded way. Let this indeed be, as our President asked, the assembly of reason. And I'd like to go on from that to say, if I may, a word about South Arabia. In South Arabia, we have undertaken that the country will become totally independent by 1968. If it is then to go forward into independence in a united and viable condition, fortified by international goodwill, it is essential that in the meantime the present dissensions should be ended, and that its people should be brought to agree upon the ways in which they can peacefully settle among themselves the shape of their own future. It is, I believe, within the power of the United Nations to make a decisive contribution to the achievement of these aims. Early this year, of the Arabian Peninsula. Would I think be natural for me now to turn to look at Rhodesia? In our view, the Commonwealth leaders' meeting in London last month was a meeting of cardinal importance. We were united in reaffirming our determination to bring the rebellion to an end. We were united on the fundamental principles of non-discrimination between the races and the building of a society, just society, based on equality for all. The British government made clear, Rhodesia. My colleagues also made clear that unless the illegal regime in Rhodesia was prepared to take the initial and indispensable steps whereby the rebellion was brought to an end and executive authority vested in the governor, certain related consequences would ensue. Given the full support of Commonwealth representatives at the United Nations, the British government would be prepared to join in sponsoring in the Security Council before the end of this year a resolution providing for effective and selective mandatory economic sanctions against Rhodesia, would withdraw all previous proposals for a constitutional settlement, and in particular would not be prepared to submit to the British Parliament any settlement which involved independence before majority rule. One thing is quite clear: Britain and the Commonwealth together are determined to see this issue resolved on a basis which is both just and honourable to all. But time is running out. In the same way, Mr. President, to address myself for a moment or two now, I don't want to delay you by going back over past history or into allegations and counter-allegations. But all the same, let us not delude ourselves. Hanoi